Welcome everybody to Chatham House and to this year's Global Forum on Forest Governance. It's a real pleasure to see so many familiar faces and a lot of new faces as well. This year we're providing Spanish and English interpretation, so you will find a headset on your chairs. So just to let you know that you just need it on channel 0 for when you need interpretation. So the first 2 sessions will all be in English, in fact, and session 3 will be in Spanish. Another practical point, so please be aware that we are live streaming this event, so that to enable those of us who aren't able to join us here in London to listen in. And as well as the live broadcast, we will also be making the video available in Spanish and English very shortly after the event. That does mean that we won't be holding the meeting under Chatham House rules. For those of you who don't know, Chatham House rules means that if you are able to quote and report on something that is said at the meeting, but not say who it is that said that. But if you do wish to say something under the Chatham House rule, you can invoke it, and we're able to cut the live stream. So please just bear that in mind. Okay, so this series of meetings began over 15 years ago now, and improving forest governance and tackling illegal logging is as important today as it has ever been, and perhaps even more so given the urgency of tackling climate change. So over the next 2 days, we will be hearing about some of the different approaches and developments that have been happening around the world to address these issues. And our aim is that these meetings help to support these efforts in providing an opportunity to share experiences and to bring all of you experts together. And through that, we hope to support you in your work. So before we go further, I would just like to say thank you to DFID, who have been supporting this series of meetings over the years and enabling us to have these discussions. For this meeting, additional thanks also to the Ford Foundation, who have enabled additional participants from overseas with support for their travel, and also support for this evening's drinks reception. And we also have additional travel support from FAO's FLEG-T programme as well, so thanks to them too. We have a few changes to the agenda as well that I'd like to let you know about. So firstly, in session 1, unfortunately, Mr. Sir David from Liberia was not able to travel to the UK at the very last minute. So what we are doing is moving the presentation from Duncan Brack, which was to be in session 2. He will now be speaking in the first session after Mrs. Rosalind Fozo-Adjei. So this morning is all going to be very much focused on Ghana. A few other changes. For those of you who last saw the agenda that we circulated last week, in session 4 this afternoon, very pleased to say that we have an additional speaker. So Hugh Speechley will be joining Kirsten Camby. So there'll be a joint presentation to talk about the impact of EITI and FLEG-T on transparency in Myanmar. In session 5, which is tomorrow morning, on enforcement. Again, unfortunately, our speaker from Liberia, Minister Ku Dorlier, was also unable to come to London. But there, again, good news, we have an alternative speaker, so at a very short notice, Fernando Navarro Trinca from Interpol will be presenting. So thank you, Fernando. And finally, we have just learned as well that Melania Canales Poma from Peru also wasn't able to come to London. We're hoping that she'll be able to join remotely, so that's for session 7 tomorrow. I think that's all the changes, hopefully. A few other practical points. If you haven't picked up your name badges already, please do so. They're in the room upstairs. We also have a list of attendees on a board upstairs if you wish to see who else is coming to the meeting. We have an information desk upstairs in the coffee room as well. So if at any point you have any queries, that somebody will be there at all times to help you with any inquiries you may have. And what else? There's headsets on the chairs, which I mentioned. Please do leave them in the room at all times and don't take them away with you. A few more fun announcements. So after the meeting today, we have a drinks reception, which I mentioned is also kindly supported by the Ford Foundation. That will take place just upstairs where coffee is, so I hope you'll all be able to join us for that. And tomorrow evening as well, after the meeting, there's an informal gathering in a pub which is just around the corner from here called the Three Crowns Pub, which is organised by Friends of the Forest, which is an informal group of people here in London who work on forest issues. Okay, I think those are all the announcements I have to make. So we're ready to begin our first session. As some of you may know, this is the start of London Climate Action Week, which is the first such event to be held here in London. So to mark this, I thought it appropriate to start off the meeting with a discussion of deforestation and the links to tackling legality in the forest sector. So in this session, I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers. So firstly, we will have Mrs. Rosalind Fozua-Adjei, who is Director for Climate Change and the National Red Coordinator within Ghana's Forestry Commission. And Rosalind will be talking about Ghana's efforts to reduce deforestation and how these are being coordinated with the country's efforts to improve forest legality. Following Rosalind's presentation, we'll then invite Duncan to speak. Duncan Brack is a Senior Research Fellow here at Chatham House and also works independently as well, has different hats. So this morning he'll be talking about work that he's been doing for Fern and Troppenbos, I think, looking at options for the EU to improve sustainability in the cocoa sector that has drawn on lessons from the forest sector. Okay, so without further ado, if I could invite Rosalind to the stage, please.
You don't need to do anything with it.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. And thank you so much, Alison, for the introduction. And it's a great opportunity to be here. As Alison mentioned, this is the beginning of the London Climate Action Week, which I think is very, very important. And it's one of the initiatives that we need across the globe to harness action on climate initiatives, and more particularly on the importance of nature-based solutions in tackling issues of climate change. And the topic that I'm going to be talking about is pretty much interesting, looking at how we are linking the initiatives that are addressing deforestation with forest legality. And Ghana is a unique case because we have all these happening in our country. And I think that we can draw a lot of lessons from how this has been done and how this can be improved going forward. So in terms of my outline, I look at the deforestation trends in Ghana and then the attribution, the forest management policy framework that we have, the initiatives that are addressing deforestation. Under these, we have three of them that I'll speak to. The components of the legality system that we have, the implementation frameworks for both addressing deforestation and legality, the linkages and coordination amongst these different frameworks, the bottlenecks that we have had in coordination and implementation, and then I give some concluding remarks. This very first slide is very interesting and very important to the discussion, and it sets the scene. So this is Ghana's forest reference level between the period 2000 to 2015, and this is what we submitted to the UNFCCC as part of requirements under our reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation initiative. A few caveats about these graphs. So this measures deforestation, not net deforestation. So we have not catered for enhancement in gas increases, or assisted natural regeneration, just areas of forest loss. And I think it's very interesting because of late there has been a lot of focus on forest landscapes restoration, which are looking at how we can bring back degraded areas. But it's not just about bringing back degraded areas. If you have a standing forest, when you take it off, the number of years it takes for a new forest to grow cannot be compensated. I mean, it's not the same. And so, even though we are planting, and even in some circles, industry believes that when they take trees, they are planting them. The equation is not that simple. And so that's why this is very important to me. And you can see that between the period 2012 to 2015, we lost a lot of forest. In between 2015 to 2018, we believe that there have been some changes, and we have been able to improve on the rate of deforestation. But again, this is the data that we as a country have accepted. It's gone through review under the UNFCCC system, and so we can confidently present this. Until we do a new assessment, everything that we put out there will just be estimates. I mean, on the second graph, we get to know the attribution, what is really causing this deforestation, and paramount of them is agricultural production. And in that, we still do a quick assessment of, within the agricultural production, the key commodities. So we have cocoa in there, we have citrus, we have rubber, and then we have oil palm. These are key commodities, apart from timber, that contribute to Ghana's economy. And within these four key commodities, cocoa production is really causing quite a lot of deforestation because of how cocoa production is done. It begins as food crop production, and then eventually the cocoa is intercropped. You can do that easily in a forest, and by taking trees out gradually. So it's a gradual stage of degradation until it gets into deforestation. Unlike oil palm or rubber, where you have to really take off the forest before you bring in these commodities. As a result of this, a lot of initiatives have come up targeting zero deforestation landscapes. Paramount of them for us in Ghana is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, known commonly as REDD+, the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. The Tropical Forest Alliance is also working very much on oil palm production, and then we have also forest plantations being established. Within the forest management policy framework, there have been revisions and then also new policies that are helping the country to put in an active effort to bring back our forests. The Forest and Wildlife Policy of 2012, which is a revised version of the 1994 Forest and Wildlife Policy, clearly emphasizes on non-consumptive values of the forest. The Climate Change Policy also of 2012 has three thematic areas on effective adaptation, social development, and mitigation, where it mentions REDD+, plantations, and natural resources management. The Forest Sector Development Master Plan of 2016 also does same, putting more emphasis on value addition, sustainable production, rehabilitation, transparent governance, which is very key, resource mobilization, and carbon stocks enhancement. Then, of course, we have the Ghana Plantation Strategy of 2016, focusing also on green investments and job creation, and the Draft Cocoa Sector Development Strategy, a key document that will be coming out soon, going through the different stages of validation, complementing the process of having climate-smart cocoa production, which basically looks at intensification on farmlands without further expansion into forest areas, whilst we grow back our forest. Now, out of these policy management frameworks, and there's going to be another session by my colleague Clement, and I'm sure he'll talk a lot more on the laws and the policy framework, but the ones that I mentioned are what really relates to the presentation I'm giving now. Based on that policy management framework, we have three key initiatives addressing deforestation. First, I've already mentioned REDD+, we have forest plantations development, and then also the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. And so I take these one by one. Now, in Ghana's REDD+ strategy, we have 5 key programs targeting the ecological zones that we have. We believe that leakage is of the essence, so no one ecological zone should be left alone, even if the drivers of deforestation are not so pronounced there at the moment. And so all these programs cover the entire landscape of Ghana. First of them is the Cocoa and Forest program, which is very key to us based on the deforestation statistics that I earlier on mentioned. And then we also have another one on the shea landscape. The shea butter that we have in most of the cosmetics, I think Ghana is the 5th country in the world to be producing this at scale. And these shade trees, unfortunately, are under attack. They are being used for wood floor purposes. But then again, the emphasis is not just on the shade tree. Other trees are in that landscape. So we want to promote sustainable agroforestry parklands and also improve the livelihoods of the communities and the ecosystem as a whole. And then we have the Togo Plateau RED program, which is addressing biological diversity conservation. There's a transition zone where you have the savanna creeping in and you have the high forest receding. We think that this is a very unique buffer zone. We should put in place measures there to stop the fluctuations. And then we also have the coastal mangroves. The mangroves are not defined as part of our forest in Ghana, but then in reporting to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change using their parameters, we still have to report on carbon stocks, and this is a very unique carbon stock. So we put in place a program to address any emissions coming out of that particular landscape as well. In essence, we just want to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. But then there are two-star events also happening at the same time, which we believe that as a country is paramount to even reducing emissions, because whatever happens at the local level really does affect our landscapes before it becomes a global issue. And so we want to have resilient landscapes and improve on livelihoods and improve forest governance, which is very key, and deforestation-free supply chains. And so this directly feeds into the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, which is also a joint action from government of Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and I think now Colombia is also on board, and then also private sectors today to say that we want to produce cocoa beans, but we want to produce this in a deforestation-free manner, which also has three key themes: sustainable production and farmer livelihood, community engagement and social inclusion, forest protection and restoration. There's a direct linkage between this initiative and the RED Plus initiative. So when you pick the implementation plan, it's just an overlap. The Cocoa and Forest Initiative is focusing on the same areas that our RED Plus initiative for the cocoa and forest sector is also focusing. And we believe that this is really a good initiative to get us the private sector support that we need to push RED Plus initiatives forward. And then we have forest plantations development, having three key parameters: tree planting, tree registration, benefit sharing, and then we have job creation and green investments alongside. But then the overarching objective is to have forest landscape restoration and enhanced law enforcement. And so we are developing plantations in different formats. Either we are involving communities and farmers in the modified Tonja system where they can stay on the land for a period of time and then also plant their food crops, or we are just engaging private sector in large-scale plantations for areas that are completely degraded according to our forest conditions score, or we have a mixture of agroforestry practices on farmlands. We're also doing enrichment planting, assisted natural regeneration, and then strengthening tenure security for the trees that we are planting and for the ones that are naturally occurring. To have a bit of understanding on how these initiatives are linked to our legality assurance system, and again, my colleague Chris is here. He will speak in the next session, and he will give a bit more or a lot more detail on this. I look at the key components of the legality assurance system. So we need a legality standard, the chain of custody standard, the verification system, the licensing authority, and then the independent monitor, which then translates into having the verification protocols, and I think key of them, the wood tracking system. And of course, we have had the legislation passed in 2017, which is the LI 2254. Now, how does this link up with what we are doing on tackling deforestation? I look at the implementation frameworks for these two initiatives. On deforestation, and with particular reference to RED Plus, we are bound by strict requirements from the Warsaw framework and then also from the donors that support us. So first, we have to be very clear on institutional frameworks. What is the governance arrangement in place? Social and environmental safeguards are key. There should be a carbon accounting system first to avoid any double counting, and then also to really prove that we are measuring emissions that are verifiable. We need a national forest monitoring system that gives us real-time monitoring. If there is deforestation, there is degradation, there could be an alert system that easily picks this up for us. And this should be a platform that is transparent, can be viewed from any part of the world. Benefits are going to come out of this process. We need a benefit sharing scheme. Who is the beneficiary? How do we assess the beneficiaries? What roles and responsibilities are we given to each other. There should be a feedback and grievance redress system. There are always going to be some complaints here and there. There will be feedback in the process because these are all new processes, not really new because that's what we are supposed to be doing as a Forestry Commission, trying to reduce deforestation, but then the initiative as a global initiative comes with its own requirements. And then we need to do monitoring, evaluation, and eventually learning. What are we doing right? What are we not doing right? In terms of legality, I mentioned this already. And so these are the different implementation frameworks. And in this slide, we look at how they complement each other. The issuance of a FLEC license can easily be linked to development of a landscape standard in the case of REDD+. For instance, in the cocoa sector, we are looking at developing a landscape production standard. If Ghana says that we are producing cocoa beans that are deforestation-free, what are the standards? What boxes are we ticking? What is the framework in place to check that really this is a cocoa bean coming from a deforestation-free landscape? If you don't have the maps, if the farms have not been mapped, if you don't have an idea of where encroachment has gone on, can you really prove deforestation-free? And so we can easily link this to the issuance of a FLEC license in another form. The domestic market, that is a focus under the legality system as well, is directly linked to us having alternatives to timber. And this is one also of the areas that we are promoting under REDD+, and the other initiatives tackling deforestation, plantations, and then also the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. Can we have other alternatives that take the pressure off the forest? And I'm happy to see Ruth Mallison here from Ecometrica. We are working also on forest risk mapping, which is a joint initiative under the Forest 2020 program, with receiving support from Ecometrica to do this. If we really want to understand the deforestation dynamics, there should be a system in place where we can have a risk map that really identifies the areas where deforestation is going to happen. And we can again link this to the forest management plans that are being developed under the FLEC VPA process. Now, the wood tracking system and the National Forest Monitoring System and the tree registration system complement each other greatly. The tree registration system really wants to enhance security of tenure. The wood tracking system wants to tell us where each tree that has been felled is coming from. And the forest monitoring system wants to tell us that a tree has been harvested today or a tree has been grown today. And so these three things really do complement each other. Again, the safeguards and verification protocols and the independent monitoring process really do complement each other so beautifully. But this is well laid out on paper, and implementation is a different ballgame. The bottlenecks, it's not really working out as you see it, and as you saw me linking up with all the different arrows. And I think that they could be attributed to different things. Multiple implementation strategies in same landscapes. We are talking about the same Ghana, the same people, the same forest. But I think we have different implementation strategies for each of the different initiatives that we are managing, even though it's the same Forestry Commission that is in charge of the forestry sector. Donor-driven initiatives against national initiatives. REDD+ is a donor-driven initiative up until a point where you are receiving results-based payments. Again, it would even still be donor-driven in a way because you are going to receive results-based payments and you have to conform to some donor requirements. Can this be mainstreamed to have a national initiative that is not really partitioning to say that FLEC VPA is driven by one donor, REDD is driven by another donor? We don't really have a real in-country system, and I put this in quotes or in brackets, for harmonization of initiatives. I think that if we are really supposed to make impact or we want to make impact, there should be a system that draws on all these initiatives that are coming together and say that this is how we are going to implement, because they are the same landscapes, they are the same people that we are going to use for implementation. Compliance to international expectations as against local ownership. And this is directly linked to the safeguards frameworks that we are developing in the case of REDD+. Taking people out of the forest because they have encroached has two phases, the human phase and then the safeguards phase. And how you do it equally tells on the impacts that you're going to achieve. And so if you are supposed to comply to international expectations, how does this then translate into national ownership or local ownership? We need to break barriers on sustainability and bureaucratic mainstreaming. There has been traditional forestry. These initiatives are coming on board as new initiatives. How are they viewed, even by the people or the policymakers who are supposed to impact change and make decisions. The ability to attract large-scale impact investments, I also think that is one of the bottlenecks in coordination implementation. Funding is coming in pockets, in different streams. And this links directly to the next point on our inability to attract coordinated blended finance. I think we should get to a point where there's finance coming into the country, whether locally or internationally, that really tells that these are the things that have been identified. This is how we should be able to work together to achieve these common goals. And I don't think we've gotten there yet. And then again, issues of forest governance vis-a-vis project objectives. Are we able to live beyond our project objectives, and how this translates into mainstreaming again and into overall forest governance, where the local people really have a say in how their resources are governed. And so for way forward, I think that forest and nature-based solutions are critical in addressing climate change, and I would have loved to see that this is one of the themes under the London Climate Action Week, but unfortunately it's not. I think it's a bit energy biased. But if you go back to the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, it is clear that nature-based solutions contribute 1/3 to the climate solution. These are low-hanging fruits with very minimal technology needed to achieve impact, highly connected to achieving the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't see any aspect of REDD+ which does not reduce poverty, which is not trying to address inequality, which is not trying to bring in justice, which is not trying to bring up gender equality. Forest and nature-based solutions should be incorporated into nationally determined contributions with safeguards to strengthen legality. And I think that's the way to go if we really want to achieve any impact on climate change. It is the nationally determined contributions which are seen as national priority. And so we can put in place whatever we want to see on addressing deforestation and also strengthening legality. There is need for more strategic global, regional, and national events. And I'm happy that the London Climate Action Week again is happening. But more importantly, we also have the Secretary General's Climate Action Week coming up, or Climate Action Summit in September. What are we taking to that summit? Are we taking action, or we are taking speeches and coming back to our countries? And to sum it all up, we need increased country effort on coordinating deforestation and legality initiatives, and then also bringing on board private sector and ensuring inclusiveness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosalind, for that really interesting overview of everything that is happening in Ghana, and some thought-provoking thoughts at the end there. That's great. We'll now move over to Duncan, who's going to be focusing down on cocoa and the EU.
Thanks very much. So it's a pleasure to be here. So as Alison mentioned, I work part-time for Chatham House, but on bioenergy and forests and climate change issues, and part-time as a freelancer, and then more on issues around trade and supply chains, particularly for agricultural commodities. And I completely agree with Rosalind's argument that we need to pay attention to more attention to forest and nature-based solutions in dealing with the threat of climate change. And one of the major issues within that sort of basket of topics is the drivers of deforestation. And of course, as you will be aware, clearance for agriculture is the main global driver for deforestation. So what I'm looking at in this presentation is one of the main drivers of deforestation in West Africa, cocoa, and the role that the EU can play in helping to tackle that, the problems associated with the sector. And this is particularly centered around this report, which was just published just 2 weeks ago, so this is quite hot off the press. As Alison mentioned, it was published by Fern, Troppenbos International, and Fair Trade International. You can find it on the Fern website. And I'm going to give you a brief summary of it. The focus is on cocoa, but of course you'll be aware that there is a much wider debate going on about agricultural drivers of deforestation in general. And in principle, pretty much all of the options that I look at in the paper are applicable to any forest risk commodity, like palm oil or soy. Okay, so a brief bit of background. Rosalind gave you some of this anyway. But in talking about cocoa, we end up talking about Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire quite a lot. As you can see from this map, the red circles are global production in the latest year for which we have figures, 2017-18, and the green circles are consumption. So you can see that in 2017, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, the two big red circles in Africa, between them accounted for about 2/3 of global production, just slightly less. And cocoa production has grown by 3%, roughly 3% a year on average over the last 2 decades. So you can see the area of cultivation is expanding quite fast. Most of the cocoa beans produced are destined for export. There's very little domestic production in the countries of origin, and the biggest importer by quite a long way is the EU, as you can see there, accounting for about 40% of global consumption, and the US about 20%, and then the rest of the world, the rest. Now, the problems with cocoa, again, Rosalind touched on this a bit, but the most obvious problem is deforestation. Cocoa production across the two main countries of production, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, grew from 2.3 million hectares to 5.8 million hectares over the last 15 years or so. Sorry, no, since 1990, so slightly more than 15 years. And so that's about 250% increase. And you can see the impact on forests. Now, this is a map of the Upper Ghanaian forest of West Africa. And Cote d'Ivoire is just here, and Ghana is here. So just look at the maps of the forest cover, particularly in Cote d'Ivoire from 1975, which is now, to 2000, and to 2013. So cocoa production is not the only driver of deforestation in these countries, but it is the main one, and particularly in Cote d'Ivoire, which is now down to about 10% of its original forest cover. It's not the only problem, of course, with cocoa production, and you'll probably be aware of the long-term association of cocoa with child labour. And in a sense, this was a matter of concern even before more recent concerns with deforestation. And there have been various initiatives designed to tackle it for about the last 20 years. Also, of course, a kind of underlying problem driving a lot of the other problems is poverty. Cocoa, like most agricultural commodities, is subject to quite wide swings in prices. And in general, at the moment, certainly, cocoa prices are too low to be able to support sustainable production in most cases. Both countries also suffer from problems in governance. Again, that's particularly true in Cote d'Ivoire. It's also true, but to a lesser extent, in Ghana, and also with poor law enforcement. And you'll see the parallels here between the timber sector. Now, there have been many voluntary initiatives designed to tackle these. Cocoa is quite heavily penetrated by certification schemes like Rainforest Alliance and UTS, which are now merged, Fair Trade, Organic, and so on. Quite a lot of the main companies, Mondelez or Mars or others, have got their own company initiatives sometimes using certification schemes, sometimes using their own programs. There's the International Cocoa Initiative, which was designed to deal with child labour, and the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, which Rosalind mentioned quite a lot, and various other things as well. I'm not going to, in this presentation, I'm not going to go through those in detail. You can see more detail in the report. But in general, despite this, we still see problems with all of the previous problems I was talking about: child labour, deforestation, weak governance, poor law enforcement. And it is, I wouldn't say it's a consensus, but more and more people are recognising now that the current batch of initiatives, although they will have some effect, are not going to radically transform the sector. So against that background, the report makes the case for EU action. And as the world's largest importer, as I said, the EU clearly has the potential to affect conditions of production. And this is, again, looking at other forest risk commodities, this is an unusual position for the EU. Normally, the EU is not the largest importer of palm oil or timber or soy, but it certainly is of cocoa. So what should be the aims? Most of the report I'm going to tell you about sets out options for the EU to consider adopting. The aims underlying all these options are, of course, themselves a matter for debate. And if there is going to be a debate around cocoa and other commodities, these are the kind of things that should be considered. But I propose that the kind of objectives we should be talking about is to ensure that cocoa imported into the EU is produced in ways that respect the laws of the producer countries with regard to forests, child labour, labour rights, and so on, respect international human rights and labour standards, encourage improvements in governance and law enforcement, and then, again, this is a matter for debate, are produced to higher social and environmental standards than are in the laws of the country of production, for example, with regard to environmental or social aims. Now, this isn't new, of course. These are similar to aims in the existing initiatives, like the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, also the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Business Conduct, which talks about all these issues. And we're talking about the need for options for the EU to regulate its market and its enterprises based in the EU. But of course, a lot of these problems cannot be tackled without effective action by producer countries. So it's not like we're just saying the EU alone can solve the problem. And against that background, the paper outlines 8 options. I'm not going to go through them all because it would take longer than I'm allowed, but I'm just going to outline the 4 main options that I think are of most value, and then just briefly tell you about the other 4 options, which we looked at just to, for the sake of completeness. Now, none of these are mutually exclusive, I should say, and indeed probably the ideal package is a combination of different options. And all of them aim to build on existing initiatives, like, for example, the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, or they borrow from models in other sectors, like particularly the timber sector. So the first one, bilateral agreements between the EU and the cocoa-producing countries. The aim here is to achieve the agreed objectives, which were talked about in the previous slide. It could be legality of production, or it could be a broader set of objectives with higher social and environmental standards. The aim to achieve those agreed objectives across the cocoa sector within the producer country. And also to tackle the underlying problems by improving standards of governance and law enforcement. And the EU would provide capacity building assistance to do that. Now, you ought to recognize this. This is modelled explicitly on the FLEGT voluntary partnership agreements. I don't really need to tell you what those are. I have to explain them at some length to cocoa sector audiences, but this is a more expert audience on these issues. So we have the voluntary partnership agreements, where the licensing system is set up, timber legality assurance system and licensing system guarantees only legal timber is exported. And we can see, even though there's only one licensing system set up so far, that by Indonesia, you can see improvements in governance in several of the VPA countries, even before they've got as far as setting up the licensing system. And I think we're going to be touching on that in the next session. And of course, Ghana has a VPA for timber already with the EU, which is the focus of the next session. And Côte d'Ivoire is negotiating one. So that's quite a sort of helpful background to think about this, whether this kind of model could be used for cocoa. And also, I think many of the elements in the Cocoa and Forest Initiative are relevant here as well. Except that setting up a licensing system for cocoa might be quite difficult. We've seen how difficult it is for timber, and for cocoa, you're talking about larger volumes of trade. There might be scope for using some kind of risk rating system, which I'll come back to in a minute, to look at performance. Now, this, of course, I'm talking about options for the EU. This is not specific to the EU market, and of course, it is complementary to all of the other options they're going to talk about. Okay, so that's producer country options. Let's move on to consumer country options, so options for the EU to regulate its market or its businesses operating within the market. And option G, so these are the letters from the paper, is a due diligence regulation applied to all enterprises placing cocoa or cocoa products like chocolate on the EU market. And of course, you'll be familiar with the existing models here, the EU timber regulation, or at least the due diligence elements of it. Also the EU conflict minerals regulation, which comes into force in 2021 and is quite similar to the EUTR, but has learned from the experience of the EUTR, and it has some interesting modifications. So under this, and again, you'll probably be familiar with the timber regulation, but under this kind of system, companies would be required to exercise due diligence in sourcing cocoa, which would mean they would need to have full information about the source, back ideally to the farm of origin, an analysis of the risk of non-compliance with the aims, whether that's legality or the wider aims that we were talking about, a strategy to mitigate the risk of non-compliance. And I said this could be based on just legality, like the timber regulation is, or a broader set of aims. And just like the EUTR works with the VPAs, and if you have a licensing system, you have an automatic compliance with the EUTR. this kind of system could provide an incentive to agree the kind of bilateral agreements I was talking about in the previous slide. Now, you can just picture the joy with which the European Commission and Member States would view the prospect of legislating for every single forest risk commodity one by one. The timber regulation itself took several years to go, so you can't really think that you want to do a palm oil regulation and a cocoa regulation and a soy regulation and so on. I don't think you have to do that. You could have a single regulation covering several commodities, which would be listed, and then you have a phased implementation, bring it in, depending on the state of the supply chain. Okay, option H. Now we'll move on to this into a sort of, this is keeping the general concept of due diligence, but looking at a broader requirement through which companies would be required to exercise due diligence to avoid breaches of human rights, fundamental freedoms, health and safety rights, and environmental damage. And again, we have an existing model here, the French Devoir de Vigilance law, which was agreed in 2017. This is limited just to the largest companies in France by employment size. We reckon about 150 to 200 companies. And also in the French legislation, those companies are also required to publish a diligence plan to indicate how they're fulfilling their obligations and to implement it. Now, this is part of a much broader debate that's going on kind of outside the forest sector. Many of you will be familiar with the debates about a possible EU deforestation action plan and the idea of perhaps a due diligence regulation for commodities. But there is a broader debate going on, stemming from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, about applying this kind of corporate due diligence obligation much more broadly. And indeed, as well as the French legislation, the Finnish and German governments have both committed to such legislation. And the Finnish government, which takes over the presidency of the EU today, is interested in spreading debate about this at the EU level. So this is not commodity specific. It applies across a company's entire operations and supply chains. Though if you were going to use it for cocoa or for other specific ones, there might be a possible role for specific guidance on particular supply chains. Because the problem is, of course, that it is very, very broad, and companies will have to tackle this kind of issue across everything they do. Okay, just to finish off, the fourth option that is of possible value is reform or interpretation of competition law in the EU. Now, competition law is designed to protect consumers against abuse of market power, such as companies colluding to set prices or carve up markets or restrict competition. So clearly it is a good thing. But it can inhibit company collaboration on sort of broader sustainability issues. And often you want people, stakeholders, to talk to each other to promote particular sustainability issues, such as setting minimum farm gate prices for commodities like cocoa, which is one of the ways to tackle some of the underlying problem. And what we can see from studies is that companies are quite strictly inhibited from talking about these things between themselves. So it would be possible to reinterpret or perhaps to revise competition law at an EU level to allow businesses to collaborate for sustainability purposes and to make it easier, for example, to agree minimum prices and not undercut each other. Okay, so those are the four options that I think of most value. Almost finished now. Just briefly run through the other four options, because the whole purpose of the paper is not to say this must be done, but to stimulate debate about the possibilities, the potential for what could be done. So I look at four other options that are kind of in theory possible, but I think probably are of less value. The first one is a carding system based on the EU fishing regulation, illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing. This is quite an aggressive way of keeping illegal fishing out of the EU market. The European Commission engages in dialogue with countries exporting fish to the EU, and if they're not satisfied about the standards of their control systems for keeping illegal fishing off the market, they can issue with them a yellow card, like football, a warning, and it could be followed by a red card, which is an outright import ban on fish into the EU, which has been used on a few occasions. It has been quite effective, I have to say, but its application to cocoa is obviously rather limited by the fact that there are far fewer sources of cocoa exports to the EU than fish. But the idea of a kind of warning system is quite interesting, and whether you could set up this kind of alert system or warning system where perhaps a legality assurance system isn't working very well, maybe it has some kind of application in bilateral agreements. Second one is the use of public procurement policies. I think these have some impact, and indeed some countries already have encouragement for fairly traded products like cocoa in their public procurement policies for public sector purchasing. And the public sector is often a large purchaser of food and catering. But in general, they have to rely on certification systems. And we've seen that although certification of cocoa has helped, it hasn't really driven transformational change in the sector. So it could be helpful, but, and it would be quite fast to implement, but unlikely to achieve major change, I think. Regulation sales, you could apply the sort of public procurement approach across a whole market and say that any cocoa or cocoa product like chocolate placed on the EU market must meet certain minimum criteria. Again, you pretty much have to rely on certification, so you would have the same limitations there. And of course, certification at the moment, I said it's high penetration in cocoa, still only about 20–25% of the market. And the due diligence approach, I think, is more flexible there. And then finally, you could put a requirement on companies for a corporate reporting requirement for cocoa supply chains, just requiring companies to publish information about the sustainability of their supply chains. Actually, many big companies do this already, so it's, again, unlikely to have much of a change. So to conclude, I said that's 8 options. I do encourage you to look at the paper and see what you think for yourself. I hope it'll be of interest to the Commission and Member States when we go on to talk about broader EU action on deforestation. I think there is no single or simple solution to the problems of the cocoa sector, and none of these options is likely to work very effectively in isolation. A combination of options could work more effectively. And what I think we're looking at is a package of measures designed to trigger action by both producer and consumer countries and businesses within the supply chain. And I think a possible good package could be bilateral agreements like the VPAs, some kind of due diligence regulation, could be commodity specific or it could be broader, and there are pros and cons about both those approaches, which we could talk about more if you want, and then perhaps a review of competition law. And of course, whatever package of measures you take, it would be crucially important to set up systems to monitor the impacts, because a lot of the problem is the poverty and low wages amongst the 5 to 6 million smallholder cocoa farmers who produce the world's product, and we must always have their interests at heart. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Duncan. That was a great compliment to Rosalind's earlier presentation. If I could invite Rosalind also to join me up here at the stage. We now have about half an hour for questions. If there are several questions, I'll take them in groups. And when you ask your question, if you could please introduce yourself so that we know where you're coming from. Okay, I can see 2 hands. So first the gentleman here, and then we'll go to the back.
Hello, John Park, Canada Wood, and immediate past chairman of Wood Technology Society. Question for Rosalind. You talk about domestic consumption and alternatives to wood use in Ghana. What are the current main uses for wood in Ghana?
Okay, thank you. We'll take a question from the gentleman at the back, and then the lady there.
Thank you very much. Ewan Grant, former law enforcement intelligence analyst who's worked in West Africa. I've two short questions. Firstly, regarding the level of deforestation, and due diligence was mentioned a lot. What are the indicators of the logistics of the illegal deforestation? Where are the clues to find out who's doing it, where and how it's being done? And secondly, relation to a possible various EU programs to ensure compliance. What is the danger of large-scale diversion to non-EU markets, whether intended for ultimately going into the EU clandestinely? I say that in the context of palm oil and the extraordinary remarks made a week or two ago by the Prime Minister of Malaysia in relation, and the BBC reporting about the possibility of his comments were triggered by dirty deals, quite frankly, in relation to palm oil, barter deals through palm oil. I recommend the audience to have a look on the BBC News website about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll take one more question from the lady at the back.
Thank you, Hannah Moat, Campaigns Coordinator at FERN. Thank you so much to both of you for excellent presentations, especially to Rosalind. I would actually like to invite you to, I would like to hear your views on the presentation that Duncan made, and which of those options or package of options, and especially in the context of what's happening in Brussels at the moment. We're sort of in the final weeks of a EU communication on stepping up action against deforestation. We hope it's going to come out soon. And within that, there may be, future action on some sort of regulatory options on agricultural commodities. So it would be really excellent to hear your views on what actually would be helpful in terms of tackling governance issues in Ghana and around the commodities in your country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Duncan, do you have any thoughts on risks of diversion of trade and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, clearly it is a major problem, and it's always, it's potentially a major problem. One interesting thing about the EU timber regulations, we don't really know in detail what companies are doing in response, and what producer countries, or what's happening to patterns of trade from producer countries, whether in fact illegal timber is being diverted away from the EU market, if the EU has stronger measures in place to keep it out. Of course, it is really difficult to distinguish the signal from all the noise of all the other things happening in the timber trade, and in general there's been as you will know, of course, there's been a big shift of trade towards China and timber. So distinguishing that is quite tricky. One piece of information we do know, actually relating to the VPAs rather than the timber regulation, is that as far as we could tell, after Indonesia brought in its licensing system, there has been a small increase in Indonesian exports to the EU, and a small increase in the share of Indonesian timber on the EU market. It's not very large, but it's at least a positive sign. So it doesn't seem like that's leading to large-scale diversion. But I mean, this underlines the need to, as much as possible, engage with other consumer countries, and China is overwhelmingly the main one, and indeed the EU and the UK have programs to try and engage with China and work with it in developing similar kinds of measures to keep out illegal and unsustainable products. Cocoa, of course, is the one where there is less of an issue here, because the EU is overwhelmingly the main importer. Most of the grinding operations, the processing operations for cocoa, are based within the EU, though there is more now being developed in producer countries. So actually the EU has more of an impact on the cocoa market than on any other commodity market.
Thank you. Rosalind, you have a few questions.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think the first one was on the main uses of wood as we have in Ghana. And the main uses are particularly for the construction and building industry, and then also for wood fuel purposes. And so the alternatives that we have been discussing for the domestic markets have been the use of bamboo. Bamboo is being very well used in Asia for buildings, for things that we could sometimes not even imagine. It's very strong. There are different species which we haven't really researched into that can be planted even in Ghana, because we have the lands that are suitable for bamboo plantations. We even have bamboo plantations that are not managed. There are large tracts of unmanaged bamboo lands. And if we really put attention to these unmanaged lands of bamboo plantations and plant up more, and even rattan as well, they could really help to support the domestic market. And it's interesting to know that the Forestry Commission has recently set up a bamboo unit to handle some of these issues, to complement the pressures that we have on our timber resources. And I think that's really the way to go. And there's also a public procurement policy for initiatives that are involving government, building or construction purposes, to look at more sustainable uses of timber. And that's also one of the initiatives addressing the domestic market use of timber. So That's the sort of way we are addressing this. And who is really involved in legal deforestation is an interesting question. The action itself is illegal, and so I think that if it's illegal, then somebody is hiding to do this. And so the statistics that we really have are what we have from either ground truthing or remote sensing imagery after this has been done. Ideally, as Duncan mentioned in his presentation, if law enforcement is really being addressed as it should be, and then we have the personnel and we have the mechanisms, the alert systems to check on what is happening at what time, then we can really reduce illegal logging. But until somebody is arrested on the highway or the forest gates with illegal products, it's really difficult to know who and how they are being engaged. And again, I think that the punitive sanctions that we have now are not deterrent enough. If you're arrested with illegal wood products, there's a fine. This fine is easily paid off by the same people who have gone into this illegal activity, and so they take it away. And so it's even, I think it's even more interesting for them to illegally harvest, be caught, and then they pay, and then they take the products away. To my reflections on Duncan's presentation, I think that it's a great move that he was shifted onto this panel, because the two presentations complement each other so nicely. And the options that he sort of gave from that report are linked to the slide that I had on where we have the linkages on addressing deforestation and also legality. And I mentioned in particular the FLEC licensing process that we have for the timber market now, and how we can produce one and link it to a landscape standard for cocoa or any other commodity that we think is driving deforestation. And again, it's interesting to look at other commodities that are not really high on the percentages now. For example, rubber is easily coming in strongly, and we have instances where cocoa farmers are really cutting down cocoa to plant rubber, and it's an issue of opportunity cost. This is coming up really strongly in certain areas in Ghana. And so if we can really link these two systems up or draw from what is happening in the timber sector into these other commodities, it would be very good for us. And he mentioned, most importantly, that no single option can work in isolation. I think it's also very important as we draw on these different initiatives, how they complement each other within the landscape, and then also outside, looking at the different markets that we are supplying our products to. And the impact that bilateral agreements could have, and the sort of coming into force of the Climate, Cocoa and Forest Initiative, which is also very, very important. If really this is not going to be just a paper action, and we are putting this to the ground, and private sector is going to stick to these prescriptions that they have given themselves, and government is also going to stick to those prescriptions, I think that we are going to really make a headway and influence impact at scale. And I mentioned impact at scale, and also linking again to what Duncan said about the competitive law, because we realize that a lot of the private sector companies, even though they have pledged on this Cocoa and Forest Initiative, are not willing to come together because they are seen to be in competition. And so we are being approached as a Red Plus Secretariat, as a Forestry Commission, with different MOUs and different implementation plans. The country has one implementation plan for the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. Why can't private sector have one implementation plan? So that we can really harness different efforts in the same landscape and achieve impact at scale. Everybody wants attribution to one or two things, and it can only be on a small scale. And so I think that these two presentations and the initiatives that we have discussed, and the concerted efforts and overarching country-driven initiatives, I think are what are really going to work. No amount of international influence can support any country if the country itself does not identify with the way it should go. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind. I would be very interested to hear from any of our colleagues from other big agricultural producers that export to the EU, if you have any thoughts on the options that Duncan set out. So please do raise your hand if you have any thoughts. I saw a number of hands, so lady here, and then this lady, and then we'll move over to this side.
Thanks, Liz Drake-Difford. Thank you, Rosalind, and thank you, Duncan. They were both excellent presentations. Actually, my question is a follow-on, I think, from what Rosalind was just saying. I really liked your slide where you talked about the difference between theory and practice, and you pulled out there this issue about multiple implementation strategies in the same landscapes and donor-driven versus national and the problems that that creates in terms of attracting finance. So my question is really, if you had a magic wand, what do you think we should be doing differently to help as donors? I'm minded to remind us all of the other Paris Agreement on aid effectiveness, which seems to be somewhat buried in the distant past. But I'm interested in your thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll then turn to this lady here.
Thank you. Panelists, my name is Antoinette Salah. I'm a farm and food consultant. My question is first to Duncan. Have the major players in the chocolate industry made any comments on the recommendation of the report? The second question is to what's her name again? Jocelyn, yeah, sorry. What's the role of Ghanaian women in forest management, in forest governance, sorry?
Okay, a broad question there. And we'll take the two questions here. So down at the front, the gentleman here.
Thank you. Clive Thomas, Policy Advisor, Forestry and International Land Use for the Soil Association. Thanks for both presentations. My question is a little bit like the last one just asked, specifically to Duncan, in terms of any reaction from the corporate sector, both while you were developing the report and since publication, especially around the ideas around reforming competition law.
Okay, thank you. And finally, yes, Penny.
Thank you. Penny Davis from the Ford Foundation. Last week I was in the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and there was a large Ghanaian delegation, etc., from the mining and oil sort of sectors. One of the things that strikes me is that in illegal logging, the whole bilateral agreements benefits the government because you get better increased royalty and revenues by closing down illegalities. What struck me in the mining sector was that you've got bilateral agreements where producer countries have negotiated long-term agreements with European and US countries to the detriment of their economies, because into those agreements, baked in, is very low prices for their commodities. So my question I think to Duncan as well as to Ghana is, given the very low prices for cocoa, which seems to be part of the driver for deforestation, what is the risk that by having all this increased bureaucracy and governance and bilateral agreements and all of this, that actually Ghana would get a worse deal for its cocoa by negotiating such a kind of agreement with the European Union? So I just want to be provocative there. You mentioned competition law, but it seems to me that the companies are driving down the price, or even the Ghanaian government hasn't been able to negotiate and help negotiate higher prices. So and you've got all these standards which will increase costs. Is this really feasible on either side?
Okay. Thank you. A good set of questions. Rosalind, can I turn to you first this time?
Thank you very much. And the question on what really can be done differently. And I linked this to one of the points that I had on one of the slides about having an in-country system that really defines the path. So again, these initiatives are coming in from different angles. I think that it's really the country that must define that this is the system for development within the forestry sector or any other sector of relevance. And any funding that we receive is getting into this pool and addressing this gap. If we don't really address or analyze what gaps we have, the way to go, our objectives, we might be receiving all these funds, they come in, and they would be solving just one piece of the puzzle. And so I think that as a country or as countries, we should have that broader picture where we have sat down to develop, apart from our development agenda or goals, these are emerging issues that are coming up. We should brace ourselves up already with a plan before the initiatives even coming from external sources. When we have that, we are able to fit each of the pieces of the puzzle together more beautifully. We can achieve more impact, we can achieve more results, and we can really measure the results that we are achieving. If the countries don't push for this, it becomes difficult, and we are still going to work as project initiatives, and it's the same landscape. We could even have a common communication plan. For example, Red Plus has a communication strategy The VPA process has also a communication strategy of a sort. We are sending out different messages. It's the same farmers, it's the same communities, it's the same Forestry Commission district and regional staff who are engaging these same stakeholders. Can we have one plan that has different components and we fit into each of those different components? I think that's really the way to go. Now, what's the role of Ghanaian women in forest management? When we started the Red Plus discussion, we realized that the forestry sector is largely male-dominated. It depends on which angle you're looking at it from. In terms of decision-making, it is largely male-dominated. When you get into the field, nursery establishment is being done by women. We have women who are forest guards, women who are range supervisors, who are in very, very hard, if I can use that word, or difficult areas, are crossing different boundaries to just guard the forest or to ensure that protection is ongoing. But then when we get into decision-making, what is really their role? And then on the community side, there are engagements that we do not really bring women to the table, because there are some communities that women are not even allowed into certain circles to discuss issues of both national and local importance. And I think that my colleague Doreen also has a session on gender within the context of the VPA process, and she will bring a lot more to bear tomorrow. But in the Red Plus discussion, to enhance governance, we had to develop a Red Plus gender mainstreaming roadmap. And out of that roadmap, we have a task force, or we developed a task force or a sub-working group on gender as a theme. That is ensuring that for every decision-making initiative, every meeting, there's a percentage representation of women that we want to see. And we just don't want to see them. We want to hear them. We want them to speak. So we employ different approaches to get them to speak. If we have to meet them separately, we meet them separately. If we have to meet them together, if we have to compromise on different times or come to an agreement on a time that is suitable for women to meet, we have made all those provisions. What we would have loved would have been to see that these provisions are being taken up and being put within the national picture, because we have a national gender policy which wants to ensure inclusiveness. But within that gender policy, climate change is mentioned once, Red Plus is not even mentioned, forestry is not mentioned. And so it's a wake-up call for us. And it's interesting that this gender policy was developed after we had the gender roadmap for mainstreaming Red Plus, and by extension, mainstreaming gender into forest governance. So these are some of the little efforts that we are putting together, but we would want to see them as skill and being adopted. Of course, change is not readily accepted in every circle, and we expect this to take some time. But even at decision-making levels now within the forestry sector, we have women who are making it count. And so I think we are getting there, but it will take some time.
Thank you. Yeah, we will be, we do have a session specifically focused on gender equity tomorrow, as Rosalind mentioned, so we can continue that discussion then. Did you have any thoughts on the question about the risks of some of the options for the EU for Ghana in the cocoa sector?
Yeah, boy, that's a huge topic. So a few thoughts. I don't think mining is a good parallel, because for cocoa and for most other agricultural commodities, you don't tend to see the long-term government-to-government agreements which set prices for long-term in the future. Having said that, obviously, what you raise as a risk is a real one, which we need to be alert to. But let's start from the position that the current future of the cocoa sector does not look particularly robust. As I said, heavily characterized by poverty, which in turn helps to drive child labor. Deforestation is gradually removing the productivity of the land, so in the long term will indeed undermine the possibility of producing cocoa to any great extent at all. So just staying as we are is not going to be a good solution. Now, inevitably putting in higher standards, trying to achieve social and environmental sustainability, that is almost inevitably going to incur increased costs. So the trick is, when you're devising the right package of measures, is to make sure the costs are borne by consumers through government aid, capacity building assistance from EU member states, from companies, and from those of us in the richer world which buy the product rather than loaded onto the producers. And there is a really wide debate, which we absolutely don't want to get into now, about whether in general the foodstuffs that we buy in European and North American countries are in general too cheap because they don't reflect the social and environmental costs of their production. But let's not get into that. What I think it should be possible to do through the kind of bilateral agreements and due diligence obligations that put requirements on companies across the board, so you can't, you're not in a situation where some companies can undercut others by behaving unsustainably or illegally, and other things like competition law reform. I think these are mechanisms to make sure that the costs are loaded onto the stakeholders in the supply chain that can bear them, and not onto the producers, which can't. But I do think it also underlines the need for monitoring of the impacts, really careful monitoring of the impacts and what's happening on the ground. So that's as much as I can do, I think, within the time available. The easier questions was on responses to the report. Well, it was only published 2 weeks ago, so I don't think we had any formal responses yet. Various people, like in the European Commission, have let me know this is really interesting, the kind of interesting, in inverted commas. I did consult quite widely with the European Commission, a bunch of NGOs, quite a few companies, including the European Cocoa Association, which are mostly traders sourcing cocoa beans, and several of the chocolate and cocoa companies. Now, a number of them have said quite explicitly, not in response to the report, but during the period when it was being written, that they think some kind of due diligence regulation at the EU level would be a sensible idea. And I quote some of them in the report. So, for example, in March 2019, Virginie Mahin from Mondelez International argued that many companies like ours are already implementing due diligence measures, and we want to avoid a patchwork of legislation at national level. And indeed, there are national initiatives appearing within EU member states like Belgium and Germany, which, of course, if every member state is going to be different, is a bit of a nightmare for companies. While there are a lot of good voluntary initiatives, she said, we still think it would be beneficial to have a binding law at EU level to provide a level playing field and bring along companies upstream and supply chain, which may not be under the same consumer-facing pressure. We need to make sure that at EU level there's policy coherence across policy sectors with a smart mix of measures, including supply chain due diligence. Barry Calibert Group, who are traders sourcing cocoa beans, said that an EU due diligence policy adds value by creating a level playing field among companies. For it to be meaningful, it has to be embedded in a strategy led by the EU, agreeing action plans with origin governments. And then John Ament, Global Vice President at Cocoa at Mars, accepted that it seems inevitable there will be some form of regulation of the cocoa supply chain in the future. Legislation could create the enabling environment needed to overcome the challenges facing the cocoa sector. And I think we will see later in the year, after the Commission has published a Deforestation Action Plan, and against, I said, this wider background of growing interest in what people are calling human rights due diligence legislation, the kind of broader approach applying to companies like the French law. And it's interesting that the proponents of that approach talk about human rights a lot, and then they usually sort of tag on environment at the end without, I think, often thinking through what that means, because there are some differences in the approach there. And I think people like us ought to be engaged in that debate. So there is a broad sort of movement here, and I think some of the chocolate and cocoa companies will probably come out later in the year and say quite explicitly what they want to do. But I think there is a widening acceptance that some kind of due diligence legislation at EU level is, they will be calling for that. And that will be, again, that's an interesting development. Companies don't often call for regulation. On your specific question, I haven't had any response yet to the competition law reform proposal, but it wasn't when I consulted on it, actually, because it came out as a result of the consultations, so people have only just seen the report.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. That has brought us very neatly to coffee time. So it was an excellent start to the session, to the meeting. Coffee is going to be served upstairs. So before we move upstairs, I'd like to ask you all to thank our speakers once again for a great start.